And the whole idea, the twist on it is, as your instructor will teach, probably tell you later on, is why in the minds of us as Pakistanis, that's who we are today. But we were something different before. Do certain periods or epochs in history matter more than others? What's in the minds of those people who write history for us at the university level or the school level, sitting in Islamabad, part of the Pakistan Studies Center? They advise the intermediate boards, make the textbooks. They write the textbooks for the O and A level classes. I mean, these things are not written abroad; they're written here, and they're approved abroad. So, I mean, there's some kind of a monopoly in the minds of people. I'm not saying it's a bad monopoly. Every country has this kind of monopoly of nationalist state history that becomes the major fundamental basis of the existence of a country. In this case, this is our country, but there are other countries around, neighboring countries, India being an example, 5,000 years of India, Iran being an example. The Afghans don't have a history, unfortunately. Written history, the Turks, etc., and then the Arab nations. We'll go back to that at the end of it. We're going to start with the Ghaznavid era briefly. Your instructor told me that she's already covered it, but we'll look at it for some important things that happened then. And what happens with history is that when a country in the modern era, like a territorial state, our country, am I audible to everybody?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. They look at history in a certain way. And what we're going to try to do here is to understand why they're looking at this history in a certain way and what it means to us. Of course, your instructor is an expert on the Mughal era, and so is everybody else in terms of major historians in Pakistan, because it's the most glorious era in our history. It was the richest empire in the world. It dwarfed the Ottoman Empire like 8 times in money and size. It dwarfed the Safavid Empire like 50 times in money and population, not size per se, but in terms of what it meant in the world, a quarter of the world's wealth was actually in Mughal India. That's a lot of money. So what the US and China are today to the world, we were to the world 400, 300 years ago. That's why that era is very, very important. But what happened in the Mughal era is actually a system that was inherited by them and expanded upon from earlier on. And that is the system we're going to look at. So your instructor has dealt with the Umayyads. We're going to look at the Ghaznavids and what they mean, and then the Horids and what they mean in our state history. These are people, dynasties you've already dealt with in your Pak studies textbooks, whichever system you're coming from, I assume, of course. 20 or 30 years ago, it was more elaborate. Apparently now it's been compressed even more. So you hardly have an idea of what's going on. There were these people, and then there were those people. But what happened primarily with the Muslim world is that the Muslim world was after the advent of the Prophet's state in Medina. The first 300 to 400 years of Muslim world were dominated by Arabic. And Arabic was the lingua franca. Everybody spoke Arabic, and to become a Muslim at some point, you had to be Arabized. And this went on for 300 and 400 years. And a lot of people, vast majority of Muslims who became Muslim, and any other contract groups who were not Muslim, but still had dhimmis, were protected people, spoke Arabic as the lingua franca. Okay, like in the Roman Empire, Latin was the lingua franca. In the time of the Zoroastrian empires, the Achaemenids, Aramaic, the language of Jesus, was the lingua franca. So Arabic was the lingua franca for the longest time. And then that, of course, generated, now we're looking at this historically. You're all freshmen, so you probably have kind of fixated views on what we all do in our country, on what Muslims are and Islam is, etc. But this generated the idea of an Arabic speaking elite or overclass in the times of the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates, generated a lot of resentment against people who were non-Arab. Of course, over a period of time, people would Arabize and become a part of the elite. But generally, normal Muslims, the vast majority of them, be they in Iran or India, elsewhere, were not of Arabic stock. The second thing that happened is from the time of the Abbasids, the armies, I'm sorry, Arya, I'm not going overboard. I have a reason to say this. I hope you understand. Okay. So what happened in the time of the Abbasids is that the Arabic elite in the Abbasid caliphs, there was a lot of strife amongst them about power, etc., and they stopped trusting their own fighting troops. Okay, is everybody with me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so they stopped trusting because what had happened is after the four caliphates, numerous numbers of new towns were settled, especially Kufa in Iraq. Okay, so Kufa was divided into 4 quarters, depending upon where you came from the Hijaz. They comprised the fighting troops. You had the Yemeni Hijazi or Najdi divide. And there was a lot of competition between the various Arab clans, etc. So the Abbasids, what they did is they started buying child soldiers or children from the ages of 8 to 10 and recruiting them in their armies as young kids growing up to be warriors. And most of these people were Turks in the Central Asian regions. The Abbasids actually sent people out to their subsidiary states, the Samanids, which is now in Tajikistan, etc. And these people started importing these young slaves as fighting soldiers who were to be the elite fighting forces. Over a period of time, there became so many of them that, and somehow, look, I mean, this is, God's intervention on earth, whatever, I don't know. You can't really imagine an 8 or 10-year-old kid with a mother tongue being taken away from their family and brought up as a soldier. But if you have enough of them, obviously the language remains. So firstly, what the Abbasids did, they took these soldiers from different tribes. Okay, they made sure they never got too many soldiers from the same tribe. So to make sure that these people never gelled together. But when things became bad for the Abbasids because of competition from the Fatimid Empire, etc., local rebellions, they started recruiting these Turkish soldiers from the same tribe. And over a period of time, these soldiers became so powerful that they put the Abbasids down, made them actually hostages. And the first dynasty to come out of these kind of soldiers was the Ghaznavid dynasty, which is the mainstay of empire or the beginning of empire in India. And the reason for that is that they did a number of things. Firstly, there was a resentment against an Arabic overlordship, although everybody spoke Arabic, but there was a kind of a resentment. And so we did dealing with basically dealing with the Delhi Sultanate. Now, the overview of the lecture is very simply this. We are going to see what happened in the past, well, let's say 1,000 years, but before the Mughal Empire, which your instructor is an expert in. What is the system that the Mughals inherited to become so great? And of course, the Mughals being the mainstay of Pakistani Muslim identity. We are the successor state to the Mughal Empire. That's what everybody knows. But obviously, something came before. So the Ghaznavids did a number of things. They were part of these soldiers who were recruited, but who kind of gelled together and retained their identity. And they started a new system. And Mahmud of Ghazna, of course, you've heard about this. A lot of times in your own textbooks, did a number of things. I'm not looking at this historiographically, but what he did a number of very important things. But the most important thing he did was he brought the Persian language back to life. And there was like I said, inherent kind of a pushback against the Arabic elite in Baghdad, because everybody had to get the Arabic elite's approval, the caliph's approval. You couldn't be a king. And he patronized a guy called Firdausi. Does everybody know who Firdausi is?
Famous Iranian poet.
Okay, so Firdausi wrote a book known as the Shahnama. It's supposed to be the most important text of Persian prose after the Muslim era and ever. It's about the legendary kings of the Iranians, etc. But by then, Persian had just become a dialect. By employing Firdausi, Mahmud of Ghazna actually brought the Persian language back to life. And in doing so, he created something called the Persianate world, which means that he created the Persian-speaking courtly empires that dominated the Muslim world for 1,000 years after the Abbasids became weak. So he has a very, very important place in that, because the system that he started by making Persian the state language and lingua franca court language and bringing it back to life is something that actually culminated in Mughal India, in Safavid Iran, and the Ottoman Empire, which was bilingual but was still preferred Persian over Turkish until Ataturk finished them off. The second most important thing about Mahmud of Ghazna, not him, but of course his Indian experts, are his descendants, because the latter Ghaznavids made Lahore first their temporary capital, then their permanent capital. So Lahore was the first Indian Muslim city that became the capital of an Indian Muslim empire under the Ghaznavids for the first time in history. So these are very important things, especially to us or the historians in our country who use this as kind of a backdrop to write history about who we are. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? I think you know all about Ghaznavids, the Ghaznavid history, etc. But I mean, this is just for, I don't have to actually, Aliya, would you advise, should I just skip this?
Yeah, I think they've got the slide and we can see.
Okay. So Mahmud expanded the empire in a huge manner. He suppressed all the subsidiary states around, which was basically, there was an Ismaili state in Sindh. There were the Buwayhid rulers in Iran. All these people were enemies of the Abbasid Caliphate. So he suppressed them. He created a huge empire, which he couldn't, by the way, hold together. And when he died, his descendants could not hold on to the empire, but the system continued. Once he died, another group of people, you've probably heard of this, they're not directly connected to us in this country. They're called the Seljuks, actually rose to power. Now, the Seljuks were the same as the Ghaznavids. They were bought as slave soldiers for the Abbasids. According to historians, look, the thing about history is when you make a judgment on a number of people involved in anything, this is very important. And this is one of the first things that I learned. You must always understand that proportionality in terms of the number of people who are alive then. So 200,000 people 1,100 years ago is how many people today? So the population of the world is 8 billion today. The population of the world was then 300, 500 million people. So it's like 16 times more. The Seljuks were one of those people recruited 200,000 tents of were converted to Islam and recruited as slave soldiers. The Seljuks actually, after Mahmud died, took over all his territory in Iran and further east and got involved in the Crusades, etc. But Mahmud of Ghazna still continued his descendants, their rule over India and Afghanistan. And this is when the first shaping of our Indian Muslim dynasty takes place. Okay, so this guy Sanjar, I don't have to speak. You can have him in a quiz. He's the Seljuk Sultan, the last one, who completely made the Ghaznavids subservient to him. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as this is going on, a new group of people known as the Ghawrids actually rose to power in Islam, in Afghanistan. They were actually Tajiks, which are Persian speaking, but they were actually Buddhists before that. So there's this whole Buddhist thing going on, which nobody talks about anymore. Your instructor can advise you more how these people slowly disappeared over the centuries. But they became Muslim, and they actually relied on Turkic soldiery, and they placed there in central western Afghanistan. There's something called Firuzkoh, which was their capital. They rose to power there, and they occupied Ghazna. They burnt it. The Ghaznavids of Mahmud, Bahram Shah, 1118 to 1157, went to Lahore. That's the first time Lahore. So this is really important. You know, I mean, we all see Delhi as the center of Muslim empire, but it wasn't. Lahore was the first capital. He went there, made it his temporary capital. By the way, there's also something funny. So the British had the system of having summer and winter capitals, okay? So your instructor can tell you in the colonial era, it was too hot for them. So Delhi was the capital for 6 months, and the summer, the capital would be Missouri or Dalhousie, or Shimla was the capital, I think, because it was high up. This is what was going on then too. This is, of course, the undercurrent of it was too hot. I mean, the area was too hot for people from the mountains or the steppes. So they used to shift capital. So Lahore became the first temporary capital. He managed to go back to Ghazna, but then he moved back, the capital back to Lahore to escape the Ghawrids. Okay, can you go down? Okay. Bahram's son Khusro Malik ruled 1160-1186, was the last Ghaznavid ruler, and his was permanently based in Lahore. And so the last two Ghaznavid rulers, the last two rulers ruled from Lahore, after which the Ghaurids came to Lahore, took him captive, sent him back to Ghazna, have him executed. And but the fact remains that Lahore was the first imperial Muslim capital. So if you ever go to Lahore, if you go to the old city, there's lots of stuff. I mean, you can look up within the walled city, which is from Ghaznavid times. Of course, nobody talks about it, but you can look it up. There's also some funky stuff I don't want to talk about. Can we go to the next slide? So after that, the Ghurids conquering Lahore, they moved further into India for the first time. And their main general was a guy called Muizzuddin Sam, or General Muhammad, and his brother. And they had worked with this same system of slave regent. It was a really different kind of a system of slavery, because a slave could be free and a slave could be king. And they started expanding into mainland India, just as the Seljuks had expanded into the Holy Land and Turkey. Can you go to the next one, please? And the Ghurids actually laid the foundation for the first Islamic empire to be truly based in India. Muizzuddin ruled the Indian territories through his slave governors, okay? So they were slaves, look, so this is not the same kind of slavery you have, like, you know, African people who were taken on boats to the US and half of them died of disease. These are slaves who were like generals, who were kings. He basically divided up the empire into many different places. So, I mean, before also, the way that the British created Pakistani, well, Indian identity is they branded names to places that they conquered. So they conquered the Punjab from the Sikhs. So all of the Sikh area that was conquered by the British became the Punjab. But the Punjab was never a province, okay? So there were three different provinces in the Punjab. There was Multan was a province. It was the biggest and richest province. Lahore was a province, and Delhi was a province. And all of these had governors. Similar. So what Muizzuddin Sam did was he appointed these governors, his slave governors, as the people to administer these regions. And he remained the commander of the army until his brother died in 1202, and then he ascended the throne. Okay. Now, Muizzuddin Sam had no sons, but he was very attached to his Turkic slaves, who, of course, he brought up as his children, etc. And people used to ask him, you've created such a big empire, you got rid of the Ghaznavids, you have all this, you know, under your belt, etc. And what's going to happen to it? You have no sons. Who's going to inherit your kingdom? So he said, who says I don't have sons? I have hundreds of thousands of sons, which were his slaves, who acted as administrators. Can we go to the next step, Aliya? So what happened is, at the same time, you had a lot of, so today we as Muslims have very few groups amongst us. And at the end of the lecture, we'll speak of what it actually means to be defined as a group or sect within Islam. Because these are very recent things. As your instructor will tell you, I mean, she recently helped me translate like this document because I speak colloquial Farsi really well, but the verb from 700 years ago changed. So Firoz Shah Tughlaq, who is in Tughlaq dynasty, was primarily involved with suppressing all kinds of weird groups who were classified as Muslims, etc. So at the same time, the Ghurids were doing the same thing. A lot of diverse groups of sects existed, which were a threat to, well, the rule of law, etc. They were rebellions. And what these people, especially in the Delhi Sultanate, did is they politically suppressed certain groups who were a threat, and it was a political suppression, which actually laid the foundations for empire, because you can't really have that kind of dissent, okay? So what happened with Muiz was that he was also suppressing various groups, and he was assassinated in 1206. And when he was assassinated, that is when the Delhi Sultanate began, because then his slave adopted sons actually inherited the various provinces that he had given them administration of. And so Khorasan and Ghazna, that is, Khorasan is the old word for Afghanistan, by the way. So if you meet any Afghani guy who says, I'm older than you, you can tell him, no, you're not, because actually Afghanistan was not a country to begin with. It was a part of larger Khorasan, which was actually made into, we can have this conversation later, political territorial states of the modern era have nothing to do with realities of the past. In the old days, there were only two countries in this whole region. One was India and one was Iran. There was no other country. This is how it goes. And the whole fight about these kingdoms was, there was Rum, which is basically Anatolia going to the Roman Empire. There was Iran, which is all of Central Asia and all of Iran. And there was India, which is all of India, all of us, etc. And that's the only three countries you have historically. So, I mean, modern lines that are drawn on paper actually should not mean anything to us if we want to understand the past. So when Moise dies, one of his most trusted slaves was a guy called Qutbuddin Aybak. Aybak, of course, is a Turk. I means moon in Turkish, Bak means look. So his surnames means moon look, which means he was probably very handsome. That's how it goes, okay? You have to understand the words behind it. So all of these had the titles. Tajuddin Ildiz. Ildiz in Turkish means, Yildiz actually means star, okay? He took over Khorasan and Ghazna. Iltutmush, Il means people, Tutmush means the one who holds on. Iltutmush means the one who holds on to the people, okay? So Qutbuddin Aybak, I mean, at the beginning of this PowerPoint, you have the Qutub Minar, which Aliya has put in, who's basically what Qutbuddin Aybak did, was made. And then he was succeeded by his son-in-law, Iltutmush in Delhi, which means the man who holds on to the people. He laid the foundation for rule. And last one was Nasiruddin Qabacha, who ruled Multan and Och. Again, Multan was a Saffron province, and then he was absorbed into Delhi. Can we go to the next one, Ali, please? Thank you. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, so Aybak heralded the Delhi Sultanate as we know, and the Sultanate lasted from 1206 to 1226, and then the Mughals took over from what happened. It evolved slowly, but for us, it's important to understand what really happened in terms of the major events that laid the foundations of who we are. So, you know, in our country, the British were really smart because they didn't do something, there's something called a family law. In the West, in Europe, when modern states were created, they had something called a family law, and a family law means that you change names of your families, etc., into newer names. And these family laws were enacted in Iran and Turkey also. So you don't know what their old structure was. Luckily for us, nobody enacted, the British did not enact family laws, and we can actually, if you do a little detective work, amongst all of you and me and Aliya and everybody else who is on this group right now, we can actually figure out what your origins are, and that is the system that was put in place during the Delhi Sultanate. I'll try to explain that towards the end if I have time. Can we go ahead, please? So the Delhi Sultanate had 5 dynasties. You probably know about this from your textbooks. Slave dynasty 1206, because obviously there were slaves, to 1290. Khalji 1290. 1320, Tughlaq, 1320, 1413, Sayyid, 1414, 51, and the Lodi dynasty, 1451, 1526. You must understand amongst them, the last 2 were fallouts from the Tughlaq era, and your instructor will talk about that, or we'll talk about this in the conclusion or question and answer. The Sayyid and Lodi dynasties are the only dynasties which are not Turkish, okay? But Sayyid dynasty, obviously, I'll explain to you what happened because our friends, the Tughlaqs, were not very kind to the Muslim elites for their own reasons. And the Lodi dynasty is, of course, Afghan. And then the Mughals come in. Can we go to the next one, please? Thank you. Okay, so I saw Razia Sultana popping up here and there. So Razia Sultana was Balbal's daughter, if I'm correct, Aliya. Is that true? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So what happens? Now, one of the biggest things that happened in the medieval era is you had something called the Mongolian invasions that nobody talks about. And that was probably the biggest and most difficult period in this entire region because the Mongol invasions lasted from 1220 until the 1400s. If they in places they were not defeated, there was no Iran and Syria and Iraq were completely destroyed. Iraq reasserted itself because it was a center of Islam, etc. Iran didn't have any rule of law for 150 years. Nobody knew what was going on. Millions of people died. And a million people in the 1200s is like 20 million people today because the world's population was that much smaller. So what happened is that the initial slave dynasties were very shaken. Their primary preoccupation was to stop the Mongol. Okay, she was the daughter of Iltutmish. All right. We can have that in the discussion to hold back the Mongols. So the slave dynasty actually did not actually challenge the power of other groups, especially Sufi groups. My PhD is on the Sorwardi Sufi order, who were very powerful and who actually played a king-making role. But this is not the topic of discussion in this. I mean, it's not the scope of this. We can talk about it some other point. What happened due to what the Mongols did in Central Asia and in Iran is that you had a huge migration of foreigners into India seeking refuge, especially people who were educated of the elite classes and who were from noble or Sayyid backgrounds. In fact, you have the largest migration into India that ever happened of foreign Muslims during the Mongol era, and they were actually let in. These people are all of you and some of us. Of course, they come and intermix with everybody, but they set up a class known as the Ashraf. Your instructor can tell you about them. Ashraf is a class of Muslim intellectuals and nobles of foreign extraction that was created in the Delhi Sultanate, which includes Sayyids, Quraysh, well, a lot of people, Turks, Iranians, and which was added to until the late Mughal era, but it actually got stratified in the Delhi Sultanate because these people came in as refugees and they populated the various echelons of administration, etc., settled down. According to a man known as Andrew Wink, he's a really big historian in Michigan. He has a series from Braille known as Al-Hind, the making of the Indo-Muslim world. And I had a chat with him at some point, and he told me that according to his research, 1 in 3 people in what is today Pakistan, the Indus Valley, was of foreign extraction. You can imagine what that means. That means each one of you is 1/3 foreigner, okay? And they came in and mixed, but this completely altered the population that we have in the Indo-Muslim, in Muslim India. And that actually defined for hundreds of years what Muslim empire was like, because the main administrators, etc., were these people, the Ashraf who came in from abroad, but not. That actually changed later on. And it was a very racist system at that point, not fully, but it changed slowly as the Sultanate evolved, because in the time of the Mughals, of course, there was this kind of prestige had ended. Can I have the next one, please? Okay, so Iltutmish's daughter, she had a love affair with a slave who was Ethiopian. I don't know, we can talk about that later. Now, what happened is that the slave dynasty was finally displaced by the Khalji dynasty, okay, which was also Turkic. And the main ruler was, that was in 1290. There was first, I forget his name, second one was Alauddin Khalji, the most important ruler. And what he did is that he laid the foundation for something that was to change the nature of the Indo-Muslim world by defeating the Mongols, okay? Now, in 306, the Chagatai Khanate, sorry. So Genghis Khan had 4 sons, and one of them was Chagatai. When he died, he divided gave each one of his sons a quarter of his empire. So Chagatai Khanate was the most nomadic Central Asian Khanate, And they were the most destructive ones because they were still nomadic. They didn't settle down. So they were very fierce, warrior-like. And they kept sending expeditions. You're talking about 100 years, literally, or 90 years of Mongolian invasion into India. The guy in Delhi sitting, you know, don't want to use any pejorative words, but, you know, troubled my empire is about, I mean, they're coming. It's like the biggest scourge of humanity. When the Mongols, everybody knows Umar Khayyam here, right? Okay, you must have heard about him. So there was a very big city in Iran called Nishapur, which is next to Mashhad. Now it's ruins. It apparently used to house 1 million people in the 1220s. Umar Khayyam was from Nishapur, just before the Mongolian invasions. The Mongols completely destroyed Nishapur and killed 1 million people there. That is, well, not directly, but because of the destruction, lack of food, famine, etc. So the Indian kings, Muslim kings, the Turks, were terrified of the Mongols coming over. The Khalji dynasty, after really 90 years of Mongolian invasions, actually got their act together and defeated the Mongols comprehensively. And that was in 1306. There were a number of battles. There was one in Sehwan, there was one in Multan, there was one somewhere else, there was one in Lahore. The last one was in Amroha in the UK. And they let the Mongol army come in. And under 3 generals, one was whom actually an Indian Muslim slave, Indian Hindu slave, sorry, Malik Kafur Ali, I can tell you about him. One guy called Zafar Khan, there was another guy called Ulu Khan, and there was a guy called Ghazi Malik. These were the 4 commanders of the Khalji army under Alauddin. They actually engaged the Mongols and destroyed the army. The Mongol army was 60 to 80,000 strong, according to historian Barani. We'll talk about him at some point, and also according to Amir Khusro. They actually killed most of the army off. This was unheard of. We'll look at the conclusion and where else this happened. This bolstered the self-confidence of the Delhi Sultanate or the local elites to an extent that wasn't because nobody else in the world defeated the Mongols except the Khaljis and the Mamluks in Egypt. We'll talk about that. Everybody else between Mamluk Egypt and Muslim India was consumed by the Mongols. Okay. Now, amongst these, can you go back, please? So one general amongst the Khalji army was a guy called Ghazi Malik. Okay. And Ghazi Malik was actually the founder of the Tughlaq dynasty. Can we go on to the other one, please? So the Tughlaq dynasty, 1220, 1413. So I think I'm reading really, really quickly. Shall slow down a little bit. In July 1320, the last Khalji Mubarak Shah was murdered by one of his generals. But you know what Alauddin did? This is the guy after Alauddin. To win against the Mongols, he didn't have a choice but to enlist local soldiers. It's a process he began, okay? Which means, and can anybody tell me what local soldiers means? Hello? Local soldiers?
The Asians.
Mercenaries?
Oh,
No. Okay.
Are
The
they
locals,
from
the
India
locals.
and not from the Persian world?
Okay, so I mean, if you live in a country and you're a foreigner, what are the chances that you know the geography? Little chance, right? Slim, right? So obviously, if all these Turkish guys come in from abroad and enlist in the army and they're living in India, they have a problem. They don't know the local geography. And there were people who were living here for thousands of years. I mean, the world's oldest living civilization, Indo-Iranian people, or let's say Vedic India, etc. So Alauddin actually started. So Malik Kafur was one local eunuch slave. He was major figure. But they recruited local soldiers, Kshatriyas, Rajputs, etc., into the army to fight the Mongols. Of course, there was a vested interest because the Mongols were completely ruthless. I mean, if you read the accounts, we can send you the accounts if somebody is interested. I mean, Aliya repeatedly told me this is a freshman class, please don't go into details. So we don't want to go into too many details. The accounts are all there. But so a process started of recruiting local soldiers, that is the local Hindu soldiers, to enlist in the army to fight the Mongols. And they played a major role in that. Now, this is a process. I mean, you're going to go and study the Mughal Empire in depth. The prestige that was given by Akbar to the Rajputs is not the first time in history. This is all, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of our historians, this is also something that was started by the British. So the British, when they came in, British came in, I mean, the whole thing that they propagate about themselves is that we are taking over. I mean, Aliya's colleague, William Dalrymple, I think his name is, his whole spiel is that the British actually consciously propagated the view that they took over from the Mughals. So the privileging of the Mughals in our state history is also something that comes from it's not wrong, but that the idea that the Mughals inherited actually came before. So Akbar's privileging of Rajputs or the Indian classes is something that is not new. It was happening before anyway. The only difference was that in the Delhi Sultanate, until a certain point, the local Indians were classified as a subject peoples, a conquered peoples. They did have a role, but that role was a subordinate role. It always was not fully not subordinate, even in the Mughal era, but the proportion of it actually lessened. And that actually lessened in the Khalji dynasty. But it's actually the Tughlaqs who are the most important dynasty before the Mughals in Indian history after Mahmud of Ghazna. Now, Mahmud of Ghazna has a primary role because he's the guy who first idea of empire, Persianate Muslim empire comes from him. So he's completely detached himself from the Arabic past. Okay, I mean Arabic is still, of course, the language of religion, but it's not the language of literature. And also, it's, I mean, fundamentally, it's just a really difficult language. Your instructor can tell you, she knows it really well. I mean, I can, if I get stuck on the road somewhere in Syria, I can ask for water, but I can't ask them to, you know, do something in detail. It's just a really difficult language to learn if you're not.
Farsi not just becomes the language of literature, but also the language of government.
Lecture kar raha hu. Sorry?
I was just adding, Farsi becomes the language of government, not just literature.
Yeah, because it's just really easy. Sorry, I had an intruder here. I'm sitting in an office. I mean, I actually came down to an office because yahan internet jo hai bahut kamzor hai. Khair, anyway, so you know, I mean, he has that point of he's starting the whole Persianate. So I mean, that in that way he can be credited for 1,000 years. And these Turkish guys, by the way, you must understand that they gave Islam a shelf life of 1,000 years because the Abbasid Caliphate had become so weak, and so many rebellions and interfighting amongst them that, you know, that literally, I mean, in terms of historical analysis, you must understand that these people gave us a shelf life of 1,000 years in prospect. But that's not the important thing. Going back to the Tughlaqs, the thing was that they actually are the most important dynasty because they enacted stuff that actually became the system that was inherited by the Mughals, that your instructor is an expert in. Not to discredit them, the Mughals were brilliant, but the system had started before. And it was started primarily by two people, but one of them, these people were nothing like what you learn about them in Pakistan studies textbooks at all. So when the last Khalji, Mubarak Shah, was murdered, created a power vacuum, it was filled by Ghiyatuddin and his eldest son, Fakhruddin, who went to become Muhammad bin Tughlaq. This was in 1320. Ghiyatuddin was basically the governor of a place called Deepalpur near Multan. So, I mean, he's not Punjabi, he's a Turk who's living there, right? But he, because he was a newcomer, married a Hindu Rajput low-level royal. And this is not like the first time that happened, but it's actually a political act by him to consolidate his place in society. He after Khalji made this maneuver of recruiting, the fighting classes of the Indians against the Mongols, opened that door, Khalji for the first time actually, Tughlaq, Ghiyathuddin Tughlaq for the first time made the political move of marrying a low-level Rajput princess to solidify his ties with the locals, because obviously on the other side, you had the Turkic or Ashraf classes, the Turkic elites in the army who frowned upon him. And this started something, this actually happened before, which we'll look at in the conclusion. This started something that had a snowball effect, because that means this guy was half Indian or became half Indian. He wasn't, his wife. And his wife was the mother of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, okay? So that actually, and in this, Ghiyathuddin actually regarded the upper caste or social higher classes of the Hindus as his social and cultural equals and not as subjects. This changed the ball game forever. So I mean, this might remind you of Akbar and what he did, but it's already going on like 300 years before him. 200, right, Ali? 200 years. Now, after Ghiyathuddin died, his son, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, ruled 1325 to 1351, took over as emperor. And he was perhaps the most important regent in the Delhi Sultanate because of what he did. He was fluent in Sanskrit because his mother was a Hindu, Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. And he laid the foundations for a system that the Mughals inherited, although he himself was a highly erratic man. And we'll just read about him a bit. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of his major biographers, so I mean, this is in the other PowerPoint, your instructor will probably send it to you because you can actually look at that. But she told me after I'd done it that you've already done historiography. We'll go back to it if we have time to see how history is created. So his main biographer was a guy called Ziauddin Barani, okay? Before that, there was a guy called Nasiri in the time of the Delhi Sultanate under Iltutmish, etc. He wrote the first historical treatise of Muslims in India, okay? After that, the second one was Barani in Tughlaq's time, 100 years later. We'll look at that in the second PPT, PowerPoint, if we get to it. But his biographer, Barani, served with him for 7 years. When Muhammad bin Tughlaq died and Firoz Shah, his first cousin, took over, Barani was still alive and he finished with some guy called Afif Shams Firoz, number of major books. But these books are the only historical records we have on what really happened there, okay? And again, I don't know if we'll have time because I hardly have time to go to the second PowerPoint, so I'll explain later. These books give us an absolute record of what happened in those times and what these people were doing. Similarly, 100 years ago, in Iltutmish's time, the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri also is about the same thing. Now, what these guys are trying to do is simply, both the slave dynasty, but especially the Tughlaqs, is they're trying to consolidate their rule in the country, saying they are the natural inheritors of the kingdoms that came before them, okay? Everybody does this. So when in the time of Iltutmish, this guy called Nasiri, uska naam bhul gaya main pura, he wrote the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri. In that, Mahmud of Ghuzna is figuring as a major figure because he created Islamic Empire. They don't believe in the beginning of empire from the Umayyads. They don't give them any ghas at all, okay? They start with Mahmud of Ghazna and how he created empire. Of course, he began the Persian world. Likewise, Barani, who served under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, 17 years, wrote a number of books, etc. I mean, I have this book I recently sent to your instructors. It's about the rise and fall of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. It's a fantastic book written by an Indian Muslim 100 years ago, literally as a PhD doctorate, lost to the mists of time. And Barani in his books also makes Mahmud of Ghazna out to be the principal figure who created empire, whose biography and whose rules, etc., all these kings should follow. And according to Barani, Muhammad bin Tughlaq knew Mahmud of Ghazna's biography by heart, okay? Anyway, Ziauddin Bahrani served Muhammad bin Tughlaq for 17 years. We can send you documents later if you want. He calls him to be highly intelligent. Of course, he knew 4 languages, including Sanskrit. Wise, erratic, and extremely cruel. He called him an agnostic because he was interested in philosophy. He had an active interest in Hinduism. He hung out with yogis all the time. You can't imagine this. Okay, I can't imagine Imran Khan hanging out with a yogi, a Hindu yogi today. But Muhammad bin Tughlaq did. He preferred Hindus in many cases over Muslims. He had an extreme dislike for the elite, the Ashraf classes we talked about, who had been there now for 100 years since the Mughal Empire, since the Mongols invaded, because he saw them as having some kind of prestige. Of course, you must remember that his mother was Rajput, so he probably was treated like, okay, you're a half-caste guy, you know. And in his time, lots of foreign people came. Ibn Battuta ka naam to sabne suna hoga na? Okay, Ibn Battuta visited his court, as talked about him in detail. Under him became the chief Qazi of Delhi, which is big, and writes about him in detail, talks flamboyantly about him, how he was mad. He used to go on an elephant at times with lots of gold and silver coins, throwing it to the inhabitants of Delhi, etc., etc. But Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a very, yes, he's a traveler, is a very secular person, okay? And this is actually what the Mughal Empire, as the instructor will tell you also, was a secular empire. These people are not religious. Their suppression of groups which are not from the same religion or sect as them is a political act. It's not a religious act. Today in this country, all these divisions of Muslim sects and Hindus and Parsis, etc., as being, you know, somebody, this kind of religious exclusivity is not a hallmark of empire. It doesn't happen. Nobody is exclusive. You are suppressed if you are against the king. It's a political act. I mean, I can't imagine Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who used to hang out with yogis and believed, spoke Sanskrit, and was apparently a very big poet also. He had this rubai about his own death when he was dying. We can send that to you also, after killing hundreds of thousands of people. But he was a secular personality. And that is the character of governance and court that they left behind an army for the Mughal Empire. Can we go to the next one, please? He had these huge visions of conquest and glory. And we don't know about this, had an empire as large as Aurangzeb's. And it covered the entire subcontinent. That's how crazy he was. He actually did it. Can we go to the next one? So this is Muhammad bin Tughlaq's empire. The only thing that you see here, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Here in the middle, they are the Rajput kingdoms, which they didn't really, and then the south, you have certain Hindu kingdoms pushed to the south. All of this is only thing Aurangzeb extra that he had was Assam, and I think a bit of Kandahar. This was all of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's army. That's how big it was, and all of India. That's pretty insane. I mean, even the British didn't have this, because the 1/3 of British India was princely states which had their own foreign policy, currency, and they just paid tax to the British, but they were kings in their own right. So that's how big it was. Can we go to the next one, please? But of course, it didn't come without, well, independent states being princely states. So your instructor can tell you later, the British tried to absorb all of the Indian local kingdoms into their empire. Didn't work out. After the rebellion, they reinstituted these kingdoms. So the Maharaja of somewhere, or the Nawab of somewhere, Hyderabad, these were not directly a part of the British Empire. The area I work in is for my PhD, the Bahawalpur state, where Uch is located, was not a part of the British Empire. It was under them. They paid homage to the Queen, and they paid certain taxes, but they had their independent foreign policy. Ouch. And they had their own coinage, their own money, etc., and they did what they wanted. Under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, all of India was under his rule. But it didn't come without a cost. He suppressed 21 major rebellions using Barani, our main author, and other texts. The Ahmad Hussain Mehdi Hussain, who talked about this guy with the book, divided up his insurgency into two halves, one that took place before 1335 and those that took place after, until the end of his reign. He states that those which occurred before 1335 were 6 in number, and those were isolated incidents caused by individuals, while those after were 15. So there were actually 21 major rebellions in his time. And guess what? He suppressed all of them except one. But that is a story for another time. Can we go to the next one? Moreover, he had this idea of world. If he had succeeded, India as we know it, or Muslim India, would never have been the same. Or if somebody succeeded him who could continue with this policy, there would be the world would be different. I mean, Iran would have ended up as a part of India. He set up a special army. It was called the Khorasan Army. Okay, now it's an army of 400,000 soldiers, which by today's standards, it's probably 40 million people. And this army was comprised of Turks, Rajputs, and Mongols, because what they did is, after the defeat of the Mongols, they actually made friends with the Mongols. So this is really weird. The Chagatai Khanate was destroyed by Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq's dad, part of them. But the Mongols started coming in, and at that point converted to Islam also, became a part of this army. Now this army didn't do anything, because what Muhammad bin Tughlaq wanted was, he wanted to actually invade Iran and conquer all of it. But because of these 21 rebellions, he couldn't. So the army he created, this Khorasan army, is above the imperial army, the central army, and the provincial army. So this is a third army that was specially created in one of his crazy schemes to conquer Iran. Unfortunately, he was stuck with these rebellions, so the army didn't do shit all. And after a while, he was like, okay, I'm disbanding the army. So he disbanded the army, and that was the reason that his empire disintegrated, because then the army, of course, these were the elite of the elite soldiers in the country, Mongols, Turks, and Rajputs, who had medals, etc. And he told them to go to hell. He's like, okay, you guys are making trouble. I'm going to disband the army. So suddenly you had 400,000 people who were the best trained warriors in the country without a job. And that was his downfall. But anyway, credit to him that he did this. Can we go to the next step, please? Okay, so then in 1351, Muhammad bin Tughlaq died. There was a revolt in Thatta, which we don't have to talk about. It is in the dynasty. It might have some sectarian undertones. One of his rebels, Mongol guy called Taghi, took refuge there. He assembled a huge flotilla on the Indus when it had water, thousands of ships, and he marched on Thatta, suppressed the revolt. And then apparently some say he was poisoned, but some say he killed some Sufi guy there, as he always killed Sufi guys. He had a problem with people who claimed spiritual or genealogical superiority, especially Sayyids and Sufis and Fuqaha like Qazis and all these kind of people. He is actually credited with being extremely brutal to Muslims who challenged his authority, all kinds. Okay. And so, I mean, apparently he killed some Sufi guy. The Sufi guy, while dying, gave him a bad dua, and he had some fish, palla fish, and got stuck in his throat. That's, of course, the Sufi anecdote. Apparently he was poisoned, so he died. Because of his various kinds of wars, etc., Firoz Shah's cousin was his first cousin. His father, Ghiyathuddin's younger brother, Rajab's son, came and buried him in Sehwan. Everybody knows Sehwan, right? So initially, he was buried in Sehwan so that the power of the Shrine of Shahbaz Qalandar can actually forgive him for all his various kinds of excesses. Later on, he was taken out of that and then taken to Delhi to be buried there. Nobody knows where his grave is. But he's, of course, remembered for his statecraft and also his military campaigns. And Firoz Shah also had a shrine commission over the commission over the grave of Shahbaz Qalandar, a huge shrine, which lasted until 1992, when the Department of Archaeology, being completely unprofessional, destroyed a half-fallen dome, destroyed the old shrine, and made this monstrosity that we have today because of Mohtarma Benazir Bhutto, because apparently she also made a pledge at the shrine to become prime minister. This is the Sevan gossip anyway. But so Firoz Shah made this huge shrine at Sevan and then started trying to consolidate what he could safeguard of what happened after Muhammad bin Tughlaq's rebellion. After Muhammad bin Tughlaq died, one rebellion was very important, was the one in southern India by a guy called Ahsan Shah, and then a second rebellion by a guy called Hasan Ganju, which resulted in the Deccan Sultanates there, which started local kind of kingdoms coming back. But Firoz Shah more or less consolidated all of northern India, and he continued Muhammad bin Tughlaq's system. Now, very important, Firoz Shah also preferred Hindus, and his mother was also a Rajput princess. So I don't know, I mean, if one of our nationalist historians was writing this or doing this lecture, he would actively want to suppress the fact that both these guys were half Hindus, okay? I mean, half Indian. The Mughal Empire was highly racist like that, because until the time of, I think Aliya can correct me, until the time of Akbar, I don't think Rajput princesses had much of a say at court, although he did change that. They used to import their brides from Persia, okay? They had a dislike for the Indians, but this is not what's going on in the Tughlaq era. Yeah,
Yes,
somebody saying something?
हाँ, अकबर
Yeah.
से पहले वक्त ही कहाँ मिला था उनको?
कौन?
मैंने कहा अकबर से पहले वक्त ही कहाँ मिला था उनको? 5 मिनट के लिए
वक्त, हाँ, okay, so the conclusions here, I've run out of time, I think, but we can't do the second one, right? So the Tughlaq period and the Delhi Sultanate in general is understudied in Pakistan, especially at the university level, and more emphasis is laid on the Mughal era, which is seen as defining the country's Muslim identity. Wow. But the fact of the matter remains that the latter half of the Delhi Sultanate, after defeat of the Mongols by Alauddin Khalji, is really what defined Muslim identity in India, including all of you. From the consolidation of the Ashraf or elite classes of foreign extraction, the reorganization of the military and administrative classes to include high-born Hindus, okay? And all alleged characteristics ascribed to Mughal India is like heterodoxy, acceptance of other religions, you know, whole thing about Dara Shikoh, translating Hindu texts, interest in Eastern philosophies, interest in Hinduism, looking for monotheism, etc. All of these things actually happened in the time of, the Tughlaqs, not before. And the Tughlaqs played a very important role in this whole spiel of defining, you know, a heterodox, highly inclusive empire in which everybody has a role as long as you don't oppose the king and the court. So, I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. You could be Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, Khariji, Zaidi, Hanbali, Hanafi, Hindu, Shaivite, Buddhist, whatever. It doesn't matter. If you're in the system, you're okay. Now, if you want to make trouble, then you're going to get killed. It's just simple. And this comes with time, you see. It doesn't happen overnight. So there's lots of examples that go back, but they're peripheral, single. They stand out. Even the time of Mahmud of Ghazna, I mean, this did happen. In the time of the slave tendency, it did happen. But in the time of the Tughlaqs, it became the rule. Can we go on, please? Okay, yeah, going back to the Ashraf classes. So, you know, these classes had certain titles that really became all the rage. You remember them from the Mughal Empire. But came before. And now, in Turkey, in Ottoman Turkey, Turkey has become all the rage in our country because of all these school dramas about the Ottoman figures. And in Iran, you know, Seljuk Iran, later various dynasties of Iran, they had exactly the same system. Only because they enacted this family law after Reza Shah made the modern Iranian state, or Ataturk made the modern Turkish state, that these things have been lost. You don't understand. For us, it's the same. And you can see there are loads of titles like Mir, okay? Mirza. Does anybody, Mirza Ghalib? Everybody knows Mirza Ghalib, right? Yes?
Yes, sir.
I should hope.
Okay, you know what Mirza means? Mirza means? Mirza in the old Turkic system is a guy whose mother is a Sayyid and father is not a Sayyid. Okay? आज आपके हमारे मुल्क में तो बहुत बातें होती हैं भाई सैयद लड़की से गैर सैयद की शादी नहीं हो सकती. आप फतवा देना चाहें तो दे दें. आई एम एन हिस्टोरियन. ऐसा कोई सिस्टम नहीं था. Mirza Ghalib, the word Mirza is in medieval Iran and India a word for a guy, a person who's an intellectual or a scribe, whose mother is a Sayyid, father is not a Sayyid. Okay? Beg. Everybody knows the word beg? हमारे वहाँ हबीब में नोमान बेग होते हैं. Okay. Beg is a person who hails from a certain Turkic background, primarily from the area of Uzbekistan. Okay. Khan. My surname is Khan. I have nothing to do with Pashtuns at all. I'm Rajasthani, okay, from my father's side. It means something. Nobody can. Khan means a person in the old system who controls a certain kind of authority and wealth, which is bestowed upon them. You don't have to be a Pathan to be a Khan. In fact, Pathans have nothing to do with the word Khan. This has been appropriated because of British misunderstanding. The word Khan is actually used by people who were given a certain title. Misconception. Sayyid or Khan साथ नहीं हो सकता. कौन कहता है? Sayyid
Mongols.
हाँ, ठीक है. Etc. This goes on, right? So this system was enacted back in the day, and it has stayed with us. If you do a little bit of detective work, all of you can actually go back. Should I really finish this now? Okay. I just read. Okay, so
we have about 10 minutes, like exactly 10
okay.
minutes.
No, I'm almost done, and we can do question and answer. Okay, the fact that both Muhammad bin Tughlaq and Firoz Shah were half Indian with Hindu Rajput women as mothers is a major shift away from the ethnocentric Turkic politics of the slave and Khalji dynasties that preceded them. Although marriage with Hindu women had begun earlier, okay, Balban had an Indian wife too, like they're like slave wives, okay? They didn't have the equal social status that was given to Hindu or Indian people in the Tughlaq dynasty. And even earlier with the Ghurids, it was rare in comparison. In addition, the Tughlaq marriages were different, they were political. And they regarded Hindu aristocracy as their social equals, not as a subject people. Okay. Inclusion of Hindus en masse in the military and civil administration begins with the Tughlaq. So it's solidified. Okay, next step, please. Next slide, sorry. Oh, I haven't spoken so much for so long. Okay, so Muhammad bin Tughlaq's mom, who's Ghiyathuddin's wife, who's like a lower level princess, enjoyed the title Makhdoom-e-Jahan, or Mistress of the World, at the court. She was seen by Ibn Battuta at Muhammad bin Tughlaq's court and was the most powerful woman at court. So it wasn't like some Turkish or Iranian or Sayyid woman at the court who was the most important woman. It was his mother. Okay, can we go down to the next step? Okay, hello, there's nothing here.
I know. Hang on.
No, you have to go back. There's an empty page. Okay, although known for his excesses, which were not as arbitrary as successor, Muhammad bin Tughlaq's systematic oppression of the Sohrawardi orders, the order I worked with, and other rebellions with their sectarian undertones, and Firoz Shah's policy of undermining certain religious groups should be seen as acts of imperial statecraft, which are hitherto not exist in Muslim India in the same way. In essence, these were acts that advised the policies of future rulers to come, which we already spoke of, the Mughals, who inherited their style of holding court, of having a heterogeneous military and civil administration, and emulated their manner of writing histories. So these guys did suppress certain groups, as your instructor can tell you later, especially certain Muslim groups which were seen heretical, and they had a very colorful society. So I mean, Aliya just corrected or endorsed my translation of Firoz Shah's autobiography, in which he suppresses these groups. Some guys claiming to be a prophet, some guys claiming to be something. And there were so many of them, but he oppressed them. He suppressed them as a political act, not because he had some religious beef with them. And that is a policy that actually made this kind of empire consolidated. And this is something that passed on. Now, what happened after the last Tughlaq king is there was a huge rebellion of the Sayyids, okay? And something called the Sayyid dynasty came into being. And the Sayyid dynasty literally came into being because these poor guys were so suppressed by the Tughlaqs, who had issues with them thinking of themselves being all that because they're Sayyids of foreign extraction. So your instructor can talk about them. Sayyid dynasty came. If you can go back to the time period for them, Aliya, the slide with the time period. And then you had the Lodi dynasty, which was Pashtun. And these are actually a fallout from the Tughlaq era. Those people who were treated badly actually became local dynasties. And finally, the Mughals came in, and that's really what happens. So we have a little bit of time. I'm sorry. Couldn't go to the other slide. You can see that. No, it's below. Yeah, this is it. So the Sayyid dynasty, 1414 to 51. Oh. This below. Yeah, below. Below. Yeah, this is it. Hold on. So this is when these poor Sayyids. So I mean, Muhammad bin Tughlaq was really involved in suppressing a lot of Sayyids. And then the Lodi dynasty after that. Primarily Pashtun dynasty, Sher Shah Suri, etc. Yeah, I didn't tell you one thing. So Firoz Shah actually did something very important. He took the column of Ashoka. You know who Ashoka was, right? He was an Indian king who propagated Buddhism 2,300 years ago. He took the column of Ashoka from a stupa and put it inside his palace as a mark of inclusion of the country's heritage and religious denominations into his empire. That's a major move. Today, I think what do you call it? The column is inside Delhi University. Maybe your instructor can tell you about that. But that was a conscious act, that they were actually accepting the other minorities, or majorities rather in this case, religious majorities of the land into their empire. And this is the policy that the Mughals inherited from them. Okay, I think we're done for time. If there are any questions, you can actually where is your instructor? Hello? Okay, I think the lecture is over and we're done for time too. You can send me questions. Is somebody in the middle arbitrating? What's going on now?
She said she stepped
Yes,
away.
hello? Yeah, she stepped away from the computer for a few minutes. You can have a question or answer session with the students right now.
I can, but I mean, aren't you over time?
We can have it for 5 minutes.
Okay, all right, sure, go ahead. You can actually look, guys. Hold on. Hello, everybody. Just type up the questions and send them to me. It's better, because I mean, it's not very professional to go over time, no. We don't want your break to go away. Hello.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
No, just type the questions up and I'll answer them. No, it's better because it's actually not nice to go over time. It's not nice at all. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Welcome. Bye-bye. Just type the questions up. How do I stop this bloody thing?
You can just leave the meeting. You don't have to stop it. Yeah.
Hi guys, are we done? Did Dr. Hassan leave?